Mobile Bay. It's... Well, honestly, it's one of those battles which, frankly, you really need to go and read for yourself to get a good idea of it. Some would call it a running battle. Some would call it a siege battle. Personally, I call it charging headfirst into an enemy battle. But it's all those things and more. It is classic Farragut in some ways, in that he's ordered to capture Mobile. And honestly, the defences are that well prepared and that in-depth that his only real option is to run them. That's one of the interesting things when you talk about naval power quite often, is that whilst naval power has great strategic mobility, if you're able to narrow it down, it suffers from the same problems as a railway. Vehicles tend to have some measure of off-road capability. It depends on the vehicle how good it is. My old Subaru could go off-road very happily. My Volvo, I love her dearly, but I do not think off-road is where her passion lies. But she's fine on gravel and those sort of surfaces, but off-road, no. But for a ship, when you manage to take away from it the wide expanse of the ocean, or even the veritable volume of the sea, and you limit it down into an estuary, into a river, into a scenario where it has to care more about the depth than being able to maneuver to best bring its weapons to aim and bear upon you, you have seriously limited that ship. However, and this is a however that's worth considering, what you also have in this scenario, in this period especially, and not as much today because we haven't carried on down that route, but definitely in this period, is that the sheer volume of firepower available to a ship compared to a land battery, even that of artillery hoisted up into a fort and built to support such artillery. Often a ship is carrying more, especially a group of ships, in terms of firepower. Why? Because you have to get that artillery to the fort. The advantages of ships is they tend to be built in industrial areas, which also tend to be where you build the guns. Or at least you can easily get the guns from one industrial area to another, and you can then load them up and it's all fairly easy. There's all the industry already there. Forts, you tend to have to build all the infrastructure to allow you to get all the stuff to the fort, to build the fort. And so quite a lot of the infrastructure that is doing the construction is rather temporary infrastructure. Temporary. And that can have an impact on what you're doing. The American Civil War is one of those wars where a lot of people talk a lot of, frankly, tosh about the elan and the daring do and the this raid and that raid and this wonderful march and that wonderful march. And they talk as if those things won the war. They didn't. Infrastructure and logistics win wars. The South, for all its talk of martial strength and all its necessity for martial strength, considering it had a suppressed slave population, it's one of those interesting things when people start talking about the Spartans, etc. Mostly the Spartans have very, very good PR. They do have periods of being very good, but they also have periods of being in a lot of trouble. And the reason they have such an obsession with a martial authority and having that training is due to the large slave population they have. Because nothing makes people seek the ability to call upon unquestionable levels of violence to reinforce their authority and what they view as civilization, than depending for their civilization upon a rather large number of people who have no say, no vote, no life, no value, beyond which you ascribe them as property. Such a group tends to be problematic. Added to that, it tends to bring out the worst excesses in both sides. That's the reality of slavery. It's a cancer on everyone involved, whether you're an owner or just a bystander, whether you're a slave or a slaver. It's a cancer. Because let's think about it this way. How good a person do you think you'd really be if there's someone you can beat up, kill, do whatever you want to do, and you have no repercussions? Everyone starts out going, well, I'd be different. But the vast majority of people, they either don't care, which teaches them that not all humans have value, which slowly erodes their entire view of humanity, or worse, they get inured to it and start doing it themselves because it's what the powerful people do. And as we can testify to the crazes that we have today with modern celebrities, humans, well, a large chunk of us are frankly sheep. And when we see someone having fun in grass on another side of the field, we will run straight over there to also get our fill of that grass. The thing about Mobile Bay is the battle is over shoring up and firming the Anaconda Plan. It's about making it more and more difficult for the South, and especially for their blockade runners, to get through. Where are the blockade runners going to? Mostly Caribbean islands. French and British ones. They have more fun in the French ones. Napoleon III was, how do I put this? Rather like Napoleon I. He was far, far more tolerant of slavery than the British were by this time. And admittedly, that was half because it served British political interests. Please note that. I'm not claiming anything else. It did serve British political interests to do so. And we've talked about that before. The Battle of Mobile Bay. Well, it's between two US Navy veterans. One, Franklin Buchanan. Well, he'd resigned his commission, believing that his state would definitely go with the separatists. Would definitely secede. Then it didn't secede, and he went back to demand his commission returned to him. And the US Naval Secretary went, "Feck no! In the nicest way, how am I supposed to trust you?" And so he went hunting glory and off to fight for, well, the South. Became their only admiral. Not really sure whether that was the most sensible thing, because I'd have said for an admiral, and this is one of the differences between a captain and an admiral, you're looking for someone with some strategic and political nous. Resigning in preparation for your state to secede is probably expecting it to secede when you're an admiral is probably not a sensible idea, or a naval officer, captain, because the odds are you have spent very little time in your state, and so you're dependent upon the letters you're getting from that state, i.e. your friends and family. And they might well not give you an accurate picture, because their picture they'll be telling you will be a font of their own biases. This is always a problem with people. Be careful how you pick your friends. Do not pick friends who are only one side of the spectrum, in terms of politics, in terms of anything. Because you'll only ever get one side of the picture, and therefore you'll be sure you're right, and you'll be confidently wrong every single time, because their biases will feed into your biases. So always try and make sure you have friends who are from the whole of the spectrum. It's more fun as well. You get far better conversation and discussion at dinner parties. Now, he was against Rear Admiral David Farragut. And Farragut is about the exact opposite, really. Farragut is loyal. Incredibly loyal. He doesn't understand the concept of anything in terms of leaving the United States. He is born in Tennessee. He lives most of his life in Virginia. His wife is Virginia. And he moves her to Hastings-on-Hudson, which is a town outside New York City, and he regards succession as treason. You could not have two more opposite characters here. You have one who is so loyal that, frankly, if you cut him open, you would probably find United States written down the middle, and one who did that. However, from the selection of things, this is the man who had set up the US Naval Academy. Up until recently, I think it was the Commandant's house was named for him. There have been ships named for him. On paper, he sounds like the far better choice for an admiral. In reality, whilst Maryland, which is the state he hailed from, did have an interesting time, and there were certainly the Sturts, I think it was, who were pushing for succession. The fact is, Maryland tried to voted not to succeed, and B, well, I think it was their assembly voted not to succeed, and then their legislature voted also not to succeed, and they voted to be neutral, and they wanted everyone to keep their troops out of them and try and be neutral, and of course they quickly got taken over by the army turning up. But it turned out quite a large majority of the population were kind of keen. Although, this is where an interesting debate has come through. There are some sources at the time which say many tens of thousands of Marylanders went to join and fight for the South. Most actual sources which are actually able to back up their stats with something like a roster of people, we're talking 4,000 to 5,000, which seems more likely to me. It does seem more likely to me, because the whole thing for Maryland was, whilst it was a slave state, it wasn't exactly as keen on slavery as some other states, or rather it wasn't as interwoven into the whole slave state genre. For want of a better word, culture. Anyway, so you have someone who is a blustering, politically short-sighted, strategically moribund fairly decent captain who'd basically spent his entire time blasting away with his ironclad against various other options whenever he'd been put in charge of them, but hadn't really achieved much against Farragut, who is worthy of his support. He is, in many ways, I would argue, he's the Navy's Grant, without the excessive drinking. He was not always the most viable for discussing things with his army counterparts. But to be fair, his army counterparts often wanted times and had battle plans and all sorts of things they would consider, and they didn't always consider when he was going, the tide says it'll be this time. The tide says it'll be this time. There is a good example in one of the battles. They go, he unilaterally moved it up early. He said it had to be done earlier. He decided it would be better if it was done. If he, in a nice way, he couldn't do it later because of the tides, so he went and did it when he did it. We weren't ready. Well, the nicest way, I could either be here where I could still support you, or I could not be here because I couldn't get past with the tide. But we had a timetable. But not all my ships are shallow draft coastal boats. There is something, though, I really do like about Farragut, and there's a reason I'm talking about him in this, because this battle takes place in 1864. Okay? 2 years before the Battle of Lissa. And whilst the Battle of Lissa will be the fleet battle that everyone looks to, I wish command-wise, and I certainly do have a strong suspicion that command-wise, everyone would prefer to look to Farragut. Because Farragut had a choice of his flagship. He could pick any ship he wanted. He could. Who would argue with Farragut if he wanted to use that ship as his flagship? No one was going to. Whereas, what he did was, he looked at his ships and he went, which is the best for communicating with my fleet? Which is the best for doing my job as admiral in charge of this fleet? He decided the USS Hartford was it. Hartford was not an ironclad, was not anything really fancy or super modern. She was a very serviceable, very capable vessel. She was a sloop of war. I'll be talking about it in a second, but she'd been commissioned in launched in 1858, commissioned 1859. She'd actually been in service till 1926. And I would say one of the worst things that happens in history is that she was sunk at her berth in 1956. This was a ship which could have been still around to this day if people had taken a bit more care of her. And I find that very, very sad. Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm fairly sure Teddy Roosevelt would have also supported it, wanted to build a naval museum around her in Washington, D.C. He wanted it to feature Hartford, Olympia, and some World War fourth stack destroyers from World War I. But Roosevelt dies. The plan for the museum dies with him. She's towed to Norfolk Navy Yard and classified as a relic, and is allowed to deteriorate, and basically ignored until she sinks and is decided to be beyond salvage and dismantled in 1956. So, basically, I have never really had strong feelings about President Truman one way or the other. However, I hadn't quite realised quite how far on the plan had been under Roosevelt before he died, and quite how much it was dropped by Truman, until I did some recent reading and managed to do some digging into it. And now, I have to say, President Truman has managed to drop, in my estimation, from a president I do not care about to possibly one of my free US presidents I would most like to bump on the nose. Okay? You can all work out what the other two might be, but he is definitely in the three I would most likely to bop on the nose. I think he deserves it. So, the Battle of Mobile Bay. And you can see the point here. You can also see the effect of, well, torpedoes, aka mines, because they weren't Whitehead torpedoes, but at this point they were moored things which people bashed into. At dawn, on August the 5th, 1864, Farragut decided the tide was running in and the conditions were nearly ideal for attack. The Tecumseh had arrived, his fourth ironclad. He had 4 of them, and they were important because his plan was to use them in front of his wooden ships and other vessels to provide the fire. And to really go in close and overwhelm the forts. That is actually the Tecumseh which is sinking there. The thing is, the Confederates have 3-4 ships. The Union force has 12 wooden ships, 2 gunboats which have some form of armouring on them, please note some form of armouring, and 4 ironclad monitors. 2 which are classified as coastal types, and 2 which are classified as a river type. If you're sitting there going, Alex, that sounds... why are they taking a river type out on the coast? Well, you know, the Union's gonna Union. Also, they're still an ironclad. Honestly, all the monitor crews must have been absolutely nuts. Absolutely nuts. And I will point out that there's a river in this area called the Dog River, which someday I do have to visit, just because it's called the Dog River. Okay? And I will have to figure out how to take my dogs to the United States to go to see this river. But we'll leave that to one side. The Fluffy Research Assistants want to visit. They basically are pushing their way in. The front of this column, as you can see, is the Brooklyn, and she is lashed to the Octorara, which is basically assisting her. She had been given the lead of the sail ships because she carried 4 chase guns that could fire forward, whilst the other ships only carried 2, and this way it was hoped that if the Confederates tried to block their way, she could provide maximum forward fire. She's also fitted with a cowcatcher, as Farragut called it, which was a device for stopping mines. Following her in succession are Hartford, a certain flagship, and Metacomet, then Richmond, Port Royal, Lackawanna, Seminole, Mongali, Kennebec, Usipi, Itasca, Anida, and Galena. The 4 ironclads are Tecumseh, Manhattan, Winnebago, and Chickasaw. I always thought Winnebago was just some form of caravan. It was only when I started studying the US Civil War and I found out about the ship, I then looked into the history of the name and went, oh, it's more than just a caravan. So, naval history teaches us all things about other history. In this case, it taught me about who we now usually refer to as the Hotjun, Ho-Chung. I'm mispronouncing it terribly. Native Americans. So, they pushed their way through. Basically, the Confederate ships, well, let's be honest, their admiral is not exactly the smartest bush on the tree, and, well, Buchanan has one plan of action in his entire brain cell, which is attack. That's not really a good one against Farragut, because Farragut is not the type to go, oh, you're attacking me, I will now hide. No, Farragut is more the type to, well, carry on. And keep carrying on. The Confederates actually tried to attack the Union Navy before they entered the minefield. What then happens is a kind of interesting fight in that because of the position of the minefield, the fort, show this picture is quite good. The actual angle they're coming at, the ironclads, and the second line. The second line ships, which were, let's be honest, the proper ocean ships, they couldn't actually really engage the Confederate ships as they were coming out, so they were just decided to get into a fight with the fort, basically, and they're just pummeling backwards and forwards with the fort. And the ironclads, they are pummeling backwards and forwards with the Confederate ships which are coming out. At this point, James Alden, commander of the captain of the Brooklyn, felt that he had conflicting orders because, and especially you can see this in this one, because Tecumseh manages to stray into the minefield, and she sinks very quickly. Her captain dies. So, could never explain the decision-making process. It could have been a navigation error. It could have been all sorts of things could have been the reason for it. There are 21 of her crew of 114 actually a lot come out alive. And let's be honest, 21 from 114, that's 21 viewpoints from a ship which is pretty packed and pretty spread, and you're not going to be seeing much beyond your own section, and you're going to be trying to get out, so no one really knows what happened or why. Could have been navigation error brought on about by ringing ears because the wheelhouse got banged by a cannon. We don't know. Presumably we'd know that one because we looked at the wreck, but there again we don't know because the Confederate shells were sometimes interesting. We'll leave that to one side. Quality control was, let's say, occasionally Italian. In fact, occasionally it made the Italians look good. So, with James Alden going, well, hang on, my ship which I'm supposed to be partnering has stopped, it's sunk, what do I do? Farragut just goes, this is when he happens, his most famous line, "Down the torpedoes, full speed ahead." He charged his ship, took the lead of the column with Hartford, which doesn't have the cowcatcher, taking the gamble that the effective torpedoes have just went off and the rest of them were probably been submerged so long they weren't going to work. And he managed to get his remaining ships to pass through the field completely unaffected. Tennessee, which is theoretically an ironclad ram and is the flagship, couldn't actually ram any of them because she wasn't fast enough. Which meant that Farragut was able to use his faster vessels to, how do I put this, go off and attack the Confederate gunboats. So, for example, he unleashed Metacomet, which was assisting Hartford at this point to go and find the Selma and take her out because she was particularly annoying him. Gaines ended up having to beach herself because, well, otherwise she would have sunk. And then she's burned by her crew. Morgan, appropriate enough, fled, well, tried to withdraw under protection of the guns of Fort Morgan. And then she escaped to Mobile that night. Now, at this point, Farragut seems to have credited Buchanan with slightly more intelligence than he had therefore shown, or at least strategic understanding. And he thought that Buchanan would keep the Tennessee under the guns of Fort Morgan for the night and rest up. Instead, he decided he would attack. Unfortunately for him, two things. His plan was to basically repeat his tactic from Virginia, which how he got his admiralty, because he'd been in charge of the Virginia when it had fought the Monitor and all the other vessels there. He decides to ram them, but the trouble is, how do I put this politely? This is a good example of why ramming is not necessarily the best tactic to deal with ships which have engines. The remaining ships prove too fast for him. And there are 3 monitors remaining. Not 1. And, well, yeah. She had very bad powder and multiple misfires from Tennessee as well. So, pretty much, she ends up being the vessel getting rammed. Including by the Monongahela, which had actually been fitted with an iron shield on her bow, i.e. a ram, for the purpose of ramming ironclads. Eventually, Chickasaw gets in position at the stern, and Manhattan just decides to keep ramming her. Combined with their both shooting their very large guns straight into her. Eventually, the captain of the Tennessee requests permission from the admiral to surrender. And at roughly 10 a.m. in the morning, Tennessee surrenders. And that means there's no longer any Confederate fleet to resist. Now, that's all pretty interesting history, but frankly, it's not the most interesting point of history here. Because we're talking about all these ships, and there are all these ships involved, and it's worthwhile getting an idea of them. But when you consider, we are talking about a fleet, most of which hadn't existed even 6 years previously, according to their birth dates. Even the Hartford and Brooklyn, which are considered old ladies of the Union fleet, are 1858 launched. And let's consider this as well. The real core of these fighting fleets, the capital ships, you could argue, of these fighting ships, these fleets, in terms of their capabilities and what they're required to do in the sort of the specific natures of these Civil War operations. The ironclads, well, some of them aren't even a year old. Chickasaw, Winnebago, Metacomet, Tecumseh, Manhattan. Those vessels, they are all 1863 or 1864. With Tennessee is 1863. She's a casemate ironclad ram. A casemate ironclad ram. And honestly, top speed of 5 knots. Whoever decided to call her a ram was being far too excited. The really interesting thing, when you look at this, is the Union are still producing some classes. Yes, they have a lot of ships which are pretty much individual ships, in that they might be ordered with sloops of war or this designation, they might be ordered as a group order, but each yard builds to the specs, but they build their own version to those specs, so you can't really call them a class. Especially with the rapidity of construction going on and conversion. Quite a lot of merchant ships are taken up from trade and are converted into sloops of war, or sloops. Interesting enough, the designation of sloop of war or sloop doesn't appear to be necessarily all that strictly applied. But I was going with the use of one book, and presuming that that author had a precise definition, because they were very precise. Sloop of war, sloop of war, sloop of war, sloop of war. Ah, sloop. USS Richmond was a sloop. I was going, you're on a page? Okay. These ships are all new. Their crews are new. These are ships which are pretty much, well, let's be honest, they're pretty much wartime only. And yes, this is the River Ironclad, turreted River Ironclad monitor, with the twin turrets. No, you would not get me going to sea in that nicest way. I would probably have a small objection to that thing going into a big puddle. But they were actually not as bad as I am sometimes tempted to believe in terms of their survivability or operation. They did have he did have capabilities. And that is Chickasaw herself. She's often used as a picture of the Milwaukee class monitors. They built 4. Chickasaw, Kickapoo, Milwaukee, and Winnebago. They lost 1. They did lose 1. But they did pretty well, considering that. Chickasaw, after the Civil War was over, was converted to side-wheel propulsion and became a coal and railroad ferry until 1944, when she was converted to a barge. She was sunk in the 1950s near Audubon Park, New Orleans. Milwaukee herself was the one of the class that was sunk. It's interesting to note that it was these 2 ships, the 2 ships which were river monitors, the 2 ships which were probably the, well, theoretically the least probably sensible vessels to be there, which were the ones which cornered the Tennessee in the end and pounded her to destruction, to surrender. They had a speed of 9 knots. So not massively fast, but certainly fast enough that they could keep away from a 5-knot ram. It's just not going to work. Then we have the Kanakokis class, which are improved monitors. Okay, so these were supposed to be more viable for sea operations. No. Just no. There are various people who have various ideas at times about how to make better ships. The Kanakokis class, well, the thing I can say for the US Navy is that they did build and commission 9 of them. And they lost 3 of them in combat. They were able to get up to the dizzying heights of 8 knots. And they carried 2 15-inch Dahlgren smoothbore guns. But the whole point was they were originally designed and supposed to get to 13 knots. And they were supposed to be the improved seagoing abilities of the Passaics, which were improved seagoing versions of the Monitor. Look, they are a feature of their time. They are a feature of their period, and they are very brave people who take them to sea. However, the one thing you do know through history is that freeboard and big waves are a thing. If you want to deal with big waves, you have freeboard. You need to have space between you and that surface of the water to give you a bit of a chance when the vessel does that. Or you can get swamped. And you could always say, well, no, I can build my ship so well, nothing's going to get in through the hatches on the top. You can certainly make that case, but it's unlikely to be true. Tecumseh was one of these, and she was lost in the battle. Her sister wasn't. And, well, Her sister Manhattan spends most of the battle being even more confrontational than normal. In fact, there is a possibility he does actually get the vessel up to something approaching a decent speed, but yeah, the battle really is over kind of quickly. If you consider some of the battles that have taken place in Virginia versus Monitor, for a good example, were hours, were really lengthy battles. This was over and done. It was over and done. Good example of Super War. I haven't chosen Hartford because, frankly, I might well end up doing adding her as a key ship and doing a bit of a history of her, just because I'm annoyed by Truman. That's entirely my motivation, but Hartford could well get added into one of the key ship series. For that. Lackawanna is another very beautiful ship. She was 1,240 tons, so was less than half the displacement of the Hartford, which is 2,900 tons. And yet, she keeps up well in the fight. She carried two 11-inch Dahlgrens, two 9-inch Dahlgrens, one 150-pounder Parrott rifle gun, one 50-pounder Dahlgren rifle gun, two 24-pounder howitzers, two 12-pounder howitzers, and two 12-pounder rifle guns. Which, and this is another thing I do point out, when I'm looking at some of the American Civil War ships and the Union Civil War ships, basically the Union is shoving them out so fast at no point do they think, hang on, would it be maybe sensible to just standardize the weaponry for this vessel? Because it would just make firing and doing some sort of broadside and management of crews so much easier, and the guns would all have fairly similar operating characteristics, so we wouldn't have to think about it all. No, let's just, whatever guns are available, put them all on. If we got space for another gun, fit it. Don't care, add more. And it's the difference between when you're doing a war emergency construction and conversion and when you're doing something in peacetime. In peacetime, you go with standardization. I'd also say it's when you have a massive infrastructure base to go from. Because again, if you're looking at the Royal Navy in World War II, or the US Navy in World War II, or World War I, they have infrastructure. They can afford to standardize. When you're building up your infrastructure as you go, and you're shoveling everything in as quickly as you can, you make do with what you can get. Honestly, they're just disappointing. The one interesting one is the Selma. Really, that is quite a cool little ship. But that's basically a high-speed attack system. That's what it's been being used for, and it's been doing quite well. And once it gets cornered, it's snookered. And it gets cornered, and it can't get away. Farragut turns it. Basically, it gets captured one day, and the next day it's been commissioned in the US Navy by Farragut. And there's various people like notes of going, your fleet's grown? You've lost a ship, and you can just imagine that. It's kind of like one of those things. You've lost a ship. That's bad. But the fleet tally you sent back is your fleet's gone up in numbers. What happened? We captured most of the enemy squadron. Although she was useful. Tennessee at the top was less so. No one really was interested in that one. Please note, Lackawanna was one of the ships which managed to ram Tennessee. I just thought you might like that. She could do 10.5 knots. However, later on, Lackawanna and Hartford actually collided when they were both trying to ram Tennessee again. They were all so eager to ram Tennessee. It was basic. It was the basic point of being a ram is you've got to be fast and heavily armored. I seem to remember once pointing this out when we did the whole naval ship design triangle of firepower, armor, speed, and battle cruisers are sort of in the firepower, speed, heading towards that direction, and destroyers definitely in that direction. Battleships are trying to be dead on center, or maybe closer to the firepower armor, sort of slightly. Cruisers fairly close to sort of the center, but balanced probably slightly more towards the side, which is the corner of the speed firepower triangle. The only system which categorizes itself into that whole speed armor section down here is the ram. If the ram is slower than you are, it ain't going to hit anyone. It's just going to chase them around. Everyone's going to be looking at going, oh, you're coming for me. I'll just move out the way, shall I? Ah, you've missed again. How sad. I'm now going to ram you. Because what they do is they'd go, oh, you're coming for... the Tennessee would be coming for them. They'd carry on ahead. Turn around. And as Tennessee was still sort of trying to come around, they'd then come back down and go bang. Smash the Tennessee a bit and then go off. It wasn't fun for anyone involved, really. Sorry, sneeze. It wasn't fun for anyone involved, but it's how you fight the battles at the time. I always loved this drawing. Mainly because it gives you all the names you could possibly want, really, when you look for it. But the thing you quickly work out is that as brave as some people from, especially the South, try and portray it as, it was just stupid. You have a minefield. Let your opponent have to come through the minefield first. That would be the first thing. Maintain your minefield is always a good thing, but under a siege scenario that's a bit difficult. And if you're going to be that massively outnumbered, let your enemy come to you. Especially if you're fighting confined waters, use those confined waters to cut down their room for maneuver, not to attack into their room for maneuver. Just because you have a vessel which is called an ironclad ram doesn't mean you should lead out in it. And most importantly, I think we can all agree, looking at those ships, the single worst place for an admiral to try and command that fleet from was that ram. Because it's the one which is the most difficult for them to see the battle around them. At no point does Farragut go, you know what, I'm going to get on one of the monitors. No, he doesn't. It does not even occur to him. Why? Because he can't see anything that's going on then. And there is no command information center, command information control center. There is nothing like that. It is entirely Mark 1 eyeball still. So you can go, well, I have a conning tower on my little ironclad. Lovely. How far can you see? Well, when there's guns are all firing and there's smoke all around me, I can't see for a toffee. And you're in the most exposed position on an ironclad. Yep. Okay. Can you command your fleet at all from there? Nope. They can't see at all what I'm doing. You might as well actually be ashore. For all the benefit you'll do. Might as well be ashore. Oh well. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. What was I going to say? Yeah. This has been an interesting video to put together, and it's about my 6th version of it. Possibly 7th. Mainly because I keep finding what questions should I put in the end, and I keep ending up with questions about the admirals in charge. And also because I had to delete at least 2 of them because they had massive long rants about Truman and his inability to understand history in there. We'll leave that to one side though. With this battle, one of the things which Farragut sometimes gets some critique from, especially from some eye sources, is the fact he insists on waiting for Tecumseh. He insists on waiting for his 4th ironclad. And they look at the numbers and they look at the results and they go, he didn't need it. Why does he need that extra ship? So I'd like to know whether you think Farragut was justified in waiting for that ship. Myself, my view is that if it's going to be a day, and in this period a day isn't going to make a much difference, and you can have a 4th ironclad, the 4th ironclad is a useful extra firepower to have. But do you think it'd be better to go a day earlier? Right, so this is the Tuesday video. Next Tuesday's video is capital ships in the treaty area, which is going to be fun. I hope you're enjoying the key ships which are coming at the moment. This video is coming out in the middle of a bit of a Japanese theme. And thank you very much for watching. Take care.